Hello, everybody. My name is Battery, and welcome back to my Minecraft 1.20 All Advancement series. So in the last episode, we gathered quite a few resources, and we talked about the all-important pizza. In this episode, I think I'm going to go on a bit of an adventure and try to find myself a village as well as potentially a snowy mountain type biome, because both of those are going to be necessary for some advancements that I want to try and get in this episode. So I have some supplies prepared, although it is looking like I need some food, because I only have 6... Oh no, I have more bread. Okay, never mind. I think that should be enough food, but then again, I'm not entirely sure. Not entirely sure where this village or snowy mountain is going to be. Oh, another tool I should probably get is a boat. But all this adventuring will give me plenty of time to talk about the topic that I have in mind for today, which is quite a departure from the previous topic, but I wanted to talk about space colonization, or exploration, or settling, whatever you want to call it. Basically, the idea of humans living on other planets. The two places that get brought up in this conversation most often are Mars and the Moon. Oh, did I find a village already? Man, I thought this was going to take a lot longer. Okay, well, there's a village basically right across the pond. Anyways, yeah. Martian and lunar colonization. And the reason for me talking about this is that recently I watched the movie and read the book The Martian, which was a very good book. You should go read it. I'm not one to usually recommend books and stuff like that, but it was a good book. It was surprisingly like funny, and it was also just like a very entertaining book. But that brought about me thinking about, like, okay, well, you know, they tried to show the, like, exploration and colonization of Mars in a very, like, real world sense, and that got me thinking about, like, what it would be like to actually try and colonize Mars and or the Moon. But the topic of Mars colonization and lunar colonization have existed for quite a while at this point. I'm sure there are other examples, but when it started becoming a prominent idea is sort of in the late 19th century was when people really started, like, considering that even an option to go live on another planet. So what I did was a little bit of reading on Wikipedia and stuff like that. And I basically, I have compiled a pros and cons list for Mars and the moon, and why it would be a good or bad idea to live on either planetary body. I think I want to start with the moon. So let's just start with the pros for the moon. So the first pro is that relative to basically everything else in space, it's pretty close. It's only, and I say that with quotation marks, it's only 239,000 miles away, which in the grand scheme of space, that's pretty damn close. In fact, it's so close that we've already been to the moon 6 times, and that was in the late 60s and early 70s. So imagine with the technology that we have now, how much easier it would be to coordinate and essentially get to the moon, period. That's the first thing that it's got going for it, is that it's right next to us. And it's the same relative distance the whole time. Like, we don't have to worry about the sun getting in the way, or other planets, or even other celestial bodies getting in the way. We pretty much, whenever we wanted to go to the moon, we just have to launch at the right time of day, and we'd be able to land on the moon whenever we wanted to, which makes it much easier to coordinate getting supplies there and like resources that people need to live. So yeah, it would be a lot easier to get supplies to and from the moon. There's also been water in the form of ice confirmed on the moon. So, there is water that we could theoretically use for our own purposes on the moon. And, even if the moon isn't the final goal, being able to put things, or be able to sort of being able to service the moon and sort of use it for our own means would make it a stepping stone to further space exploration. Because, to escape the Earth's atmosphere, it takes quite a significant amount of energy and fuel and stuff like that, whereas the moon, which I'll touch on in a second, has basically no atmosphere, and overall is just like less dense than, well, I shouldn't say less dense, but less massive than Earth, so it's much easier to get things off of the moon. And you'd essentially be saving 239,000 miles to the next place that you need to get to, which, again, in the grand scheme of things, is not that much of a... It isn't that much shorter of a trip, but when you're talking about traveling in space, like, any little bit helps. But moving right along to the cons, like I just said, the moon basically doesn't have an atmosphere. Like, it's ridiculously thin to the point where it might as well not even have one. And because there is no atmosphere, radiation from the sun becomes a real issue. And so people living on the moon would have to find a way to navigate around that radiation. So radiation becomes a big concern when you have no atmosphere. Solar flares would be a huge issue that we'd have to overcome because the moon also has no magnetic field of its own. So, yeah, you'd be exposed to huge, electromagnetic pulses from the sun. And again, that would be quite concerning for anybody attempting to live on the moon. Let's see. Surface temperatures on the moon also range quite drastically. What I found was that it ranges from about 140 degrees Celsius to negative 171 degrees Celsius, which is both extremely hot and immensely cold. And what's potentially worse about that is that the temperature at a given spot on the moon is basically entirely dependent upon whether or not that spot is getting sunlight, direct sunlight. So, the moon has... So, the side of the moon that's always facing away from Earth is any spot that's in shadow. Any spots that are in shadow immediately become way colder. And any spots that are in the sun become too hot for people to comfortably live on. So, the ability to regulate the temperature would be a hard task to, or a hard thing to overcome, especially on any sort of large scale, just due to the amount of energy that would require. Let's see. Another bad thing is that liquid water can't exist on the surface of the moon due to the previously explained lack of atmosphere and extreme amounts of radiation. So, while there is ice on the moon, that's the only form it can exist in. Otherwise, it would radiate and essentially break down. Yeah, so basically water can't exist on the surface because it would just get radiated by the sun and then immediately break down into gaseous forms and then dissipate into space. It's also thought that the ice pretty much has only come from comet impacts on the moon, which means that the moon itself isn't really the source of the water that's on it. It's from impacts from comets. And I put that as a con because it would make it difficult to locate steady sources of water. And it would also mean that, water would essentially... You'd have a very irregular source of water. Because comets don't come around at specific intervals. So, people living on the moon would essentially be waiting for comets to hit and then have to go harvest that water, which could make it a bit of a tricky and time-consuming process. Also, if that comet ends up hitting the side of the moon that is currently sunny, then all of that ice and stuff would just, it would just sublimate away. It would evaporate almost, well, not immediately, but it would evaporate and then dissipate into space, which obviously does not help if your goal is to live on the moon. So ice is only on the shadowed side of the moon. So, the people who live on the moon would have to deal with all of their water coming from the dark side of the moon. And the last con that I have written here is that the moon has about 1/5 the gravity of Earth and about half the gravity of Mars. Which, you might be thinking, well, why is that a bad thing? We can move objects easier if there's less gravity. But at the same time, gravity is kind of a necessary component for life to be able to survive somewhere. Because, everything that lives on Earth has adapted to be able to survive with the atmospheric pressure and gravity on Earth. If you change that, it starts messing with things on a molecular and, cell type level. And that's potentially dangerous and life-threatening for, any living thing. So, having such little gravity could cause significant damage to anything that attempts to live on the moon. But it's kind of a pro and a con because, again, it makes it easier to get things off of the moon. So, launching off to another planet or back to Earth requires significantly less energy than launching something from Earth. I feel like it's been thrown around a little bit in the space community that while the moon probably isn't suitable for living, that it would be a good launch point and refuel point if we could establish if we could establish a sort of outpost of sorts on the moon. So yeah. Do I think it'll happen in my lifetime? It's hard to say. I don't think that within my lifetime, there will be, like, a station necessarily on the moon, or, like, you know, we certainly won't have colonized it for our own use. We might be able to send more people there, and, you know, perhaps send supplies to the moon to allow exploration of, say, Mars or something that's much further away. And that sort of brings me on to my pros about Mars. So, one very significant pro is that there is a lot of ice at the poles on Mars. There is quite a significant amount of ice at the poles, and so that already establishes that there is, or we know that there is water in ice form on Mars. Another pro is that Mars does have an atmosphere, and that atmosphere is mainly comprised of CO2. Now, that, you know, CO2 in and of itself isn't what's going to allow us to live on Mars, because obviously humans can't breathe CO2, we just die. But CO2 is necessary for plant life, and, you know, if you were able to break down CO2 somehow and free up that oxygen, there's a plentiful supply of it in the atmosphere. So if you were able to break the oxygen apart from the carbon, then you could potentially have a significant source of oxygen. Kind of what they talked about, like, in The Martian. And, you know, I feel like that's a pretty plausible way of going about it. Just sort of, you know, breaking down what's already there and using it. Let's see, another pro about Mars is that it has seasons similar to Earth, because it has it's tilted similarly. It is tilted similarly on its axis to Earth. So the seasons kind of work the same that they do on Earth. It's just that Mars's year is about twice as long as Earth's is, so each season is about twice as long. It also has nutrients in the soil. The ones that were listed specifically were magnesium, sodium, potassium, and chlorine, which are necessary for plant growth. Mars's soil contains all of those, so again, theoretically, growing plants would be a viable option. And let's see, another thing that I'm taking pretty much directly from the Wikipedia article, it said it is estimated that the amount of water in the upper mantle of Mars, represented by hydroxyl ions contained within Martian minerals, is equal to or greater than that of Earth at 50 to 300 parts per million of water, which is enough to cover the entire planet to a depth of 200 to 1,000 meters. Which I'm not entirely sure if, that water that they claim is there would be extractable or usable in any sort of way, but, it's another thing of, like, if we can figure out how to do it, we'll have way more than enough water than we could ever possibly need. And if we really wanted to, with that amount of water, we could, well, we wouldn't be able to because I'll get to it in a second, but it's much like the moon in that it can't have liquid water on the surface. But all things considered, we get Mars habitable and we somehow form an atmosphere around Mars. We would be able to essentially create oceans. But it does say that it's in the upper mantle, and from what I remember from the article, it says that the crust of Mars is about 50 kilometers deep, and for comparison, the Earth's crust is about 40 kilometers deep. So the crust of Mars is even thicker than the Earth's, and we've never, been able to get anywhere close to getting through the crust of the Earth. It hasn't even come close. So, again, we'd have to figure out the technology to be able to drill 50 kilometers under the surface of a planet in order to even have a chance of accessing the theoretical water that they say is there. And honestly, that's kind of the crux of the whole issue of, well, I guess it's not really an issue, but the idea of colonizing a different planet is that we'd have to take pretty tremendous leaps in technology in order to be able to sustain life on that planet. So that's what I have for the pros for Mars. The cons are that, on average, Mars is about 140 million miles away from Earth. And that's an average. So sometimes it's a little closer, other times it is way farther, and in fact sometimes it is, on the other side of the sun, so it would be next to impossible to travel to it. Because you'd have to shoot yourself around the sun, and that seems quite dangerous. Yeah, so you can't just kind of travel to Mars whenever you want to, like the moon. It has to be in very specific windows of time when the two planets are aligned in such a way that it makes it easiest to travel between the two. And to kind of try and put that into comparison, to try and compare that to the moon is somewhere around 500 times closer than Mars. Again, on average. So, like I was saying with the whole setting up a station on the moon doesn't really get you too much closer to anything, you'd cut off 1/500th of the trip to Mars. Which, again, as far as space travel is concerned, that's not insignificant, but it's also not that significant either. Another con is that, Mars still only has about 2/5 the gravity of Earth, so about 40% of the gravity. So it has a similar issue to the Moon, where it's like, living things have become accustomed to the gravity on Earth, and therefore are not going to like being subjected to 40% or 60% less gravity at any given time. Yeah, so things don't like super low gravity, and so living on Mars would not alleviate that issue. And similar problem to the Moon again. No liquid water can exist on the surface of Mars. Again, because it has an atmosphere, but it's like ridiculously thin. Like, it's not protecting you from much, and the like atmospheric pressure on Mars is minuscule compared to that of Earth. So, no liquid water, and the atmosphere is super thin, so you have a similar issue of radiation from the sun, although it is only slightly worse than the International Space Station, so it is protecting you from a decent bit. It's not like the Moon, where there's no protection at all, and you're just getting beamed the entire time by radiation from the sun. But it's also not anywhere near as good as Earth's atmosphere protecting you from radiation. It also, again, does not have a magnetic field. There are, like, local magnetic fields on Mars due to the presence of iron, but it's not anywhere near the, like, planetary dipole that Earth is. It's just small local magnetic fields. Let's see. Oh, there's also large amounts of geological activity, and that comes in the form of dust storms. Again, kind of like what you see in The Martian, where dust storms can have wind speeds up to like 100 miles an hour, which is extremely dangerous. So not only do you have to contend with 100 mile per hour dust storms, you also have to contend to Mars quakes, which I think is funny because obviously the term earthquake has the word Earth in it, so it makes sense that they changed it to Mars quake. It just sounds a little funny, but yeah, apparently there are tons of Mars quakes happening, and there's just lots of seismic activity. I couldn't find anywhere, like, what the magnitude of these Mars quakes were, so I don't know if it's, like, just a little rumble every now and again, or if it's, like, magnitude 7, 8, 9 earthquakes happening, like, all the time. You know, depending upon the strength, that could be a very concerning hazard to deal with. My next point I already went over. The surface level radiation is still quite bad, although it's only slightly higher than the International Space Station, but in no means is it a healthy amount of radiation. like, again, referencing back to the Wikipedia article, I think they said that that amount is about 200 times what you receive standing on the surface of Earth. So, obviously, being exposed to that level of radiation would be extremely detrimental to your health. Oh, my next con is that while the soil might be able to sustain plant growth with the minerals that are in it, the soil also contains something called salt perchlorate, and apparently in the concentration that it is in the Martian soil, it's toxic to people. So, it's like, yes, it contains the minerals that you need to potentially grow plants, but it also has this thing that could kill you. So you probably don't want to be growing your plants in with a mineral that will kill you. And my final con for Mars colonization is that we have yet to get anybody on Mars. So it's kind of hard to think about colonizing or settling a planet that you haven't even been able to get a person to at all. And with anything, there will be problems that arise that you didn't account for just because you've never actually, been to the place. You've only, done a bunch of math about it and done a bunch of research about it. But, it's kind of the saying of no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And so the enemy in this case would be Mars. And yeah, so until we get humans onto Mars and actually figure out what struggles they face on the planet, it'll be hard to even start thinking about living there. At least with the moon, we've been there a few times, enough to know that habitation is extremely unlikely, especially with the technology we have now. It's not to say that it's impossible and that it could never happen, but it's not feasible with what we have right now. And kind of circling back to what I was saying earlier, Mars colonization is significantly further out than moon colonization. So, if I don't think that moon colonization is going to happen in my lifetime, there's no way in hell that Mars colonization is going to happen anytime soon. You do face some similar problems between the two, so figuring out how to survive on the moon would certainly give you some insight and some solutions that would work on Mars. But at the same time, each of them has different challenges that you have to face, and it's also significantly harder to get to Mars in the first place. So, that's a whole major issue in and of itself, is just the time difference and the distance difference between the two, as to how feasible it is and how quickly we could do it. do I think I'll see us get a person to Mars at some point in my lifetime? I think that will happen. I definitely think that we will be able to get somebody to Mars within my lifetime. And, NASA's been talking about sending people to Mars since I was a kid, basically. So, whether or not that comes to fruition within my lifetime, is a whole different thing, but, they're already talking about it, and therefore, so, I definitely think we'll get people to Mars in my lifetime, and NASA's also been talking about sending people back to the moon, later in the 2020s already. So we'll probably also have people go to the moon again within my lifetime. I'm sure it'll be an exciting and amazing thing to witness, but we're still super far away from any type of living on another planet. Like, we have people living in space currently, but it's kind of the thing of, like, they can only be up there temporarily because of all of the negative effects of, like, low gravity and the radiation from the sun and stuff like that. So there have been people that have lived on the ISS for a year, 2 years, stuff like that. But it's nowhere near, like, permanent living situation. And so it's very unlikely to happen while I'm alive. Unless we miraculously cure aging somehow, which is perhaps a topic for another day, but, if that happens, then maybe it will happen in my lifetime. Maybe everything in the future will happen during my lifetime if they can figure out how to make people live forever. But, that's also not super likely. So, yeah, I probably won't see that, but, and I'm not entirely sure of what the timeline would look like for colonizing another planet. Because, I'm not a rocket scientist or anything. I don't work at NASA or anything. So I have no idea what technology we already have and what they're working on to solve those problems. So it's hard for me to tell where we're at and how long it'll be until we are able to colonize another planet. But if I had to take a wild, just kind of stab in the dark guess as to how long it'll take, it'll probably be, I'd guess, at least, like, 250 years from now. Like a quarter millennia from now. Just because I feel like we haven't quite learned how to live sustainably on Earth, and to try and colonize another planet, you'd have to be able to live extremely sustainably on another planet. It's kind of the thing of, like, we have to solve the issues at home before we're able to move on to other planets, if that makes sense. I've noticed that this world is very hot and very dry, so there's been lots of deserts and badlands and things like that, and not a lot of snow. So it's going to take me longer than I expected to find snowy mountains, which is sad. I think I'm going to leave it there for this episode. I've gone through my entire list of pros and cons for living on both the moon and Mars. I think I'm gonna leave it here. In the next episode, I will probably continue looking for the snowy mountain. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like. If you loved it, make sure to subscribe. And again, make sure to leave your suggestions down below for things you would like me to talk about. And, you know, if you have a good one, I'll probably talk about it in a later episode. I've been Battery, and I'll see you later.